you. We will now go on to agenda item number 3. It's the Westside Specific Plan Study Session. Public Works Director Wall will present this item.
Good morning, Honorable Mayor and members of the City Council. Just over 2 years ago, the City Council approved advertising an RFP. This was the first step in the process of developing the Westside Specific Plan. Since that time, city staff and the city's consultant team have been meeting with stakeholders to understand their needs and desires for the West Side. During this time, we have also been conducting studies to help refine the vision that will meet those needs and desires. The purpose of today's study session is to go over our work to date and check in with the council to ensure that we're on the right track. I will now hand this over to Deputy Director Manuel Garcia for historical context.
Good morning, Mayor, councilors, city administrator, department heads, staff, members of the general public, both here and remote. Talk about that presentation. So how did I become the historian? So Hugh Hauser did a tour of the power plant, and I was a docent. And working at the power plant, you come across a lot of the records, and you find out, what happened in the city of Vernon. One of the interesting, I've read 2 interesting records, log entries. One was the when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, and when Kennedy died. So that kind of gives you like a perspective. Next slide, please. Perfect. The city of Vernon was founded in 1905. And at the time, it was pretty much just farmland. 1920s saw the establishment of an exclusively industrial zone and a transition from farming to industry. But industry runs on power. So in 1933, the Vernon power plant came into existence, in operation. And that was a bold move. If you see a picture of that time, you see the power plant surrounded by farm. That was an interesting sight. A bold move, a visionary move. At the same time, Bethlehem Steel moved from the East Coast to the West Coast. And the decision to build that power plant was a vision of the industrial aspect of the city of Vernon, and industry runs on power. For the next 50 years, Vernon was pretty much exclusively industrial, inclusively industrial. And basically, companies like Bethlehem Steel, Alcoa, Norris Industries thrived primarily because of World War II and the need for steel. 1980s, Bethlehem Steel closed, and that was like interesting. Wow, Bethlehem Steel is no longer in the city of Vernon. I remember as a teenager riding my bike adjacent to the mill on Slauson Avenue and feeling the heat from the furnace. And you could see the number of people working there, and you could actually see the molten steel as it was being processed. At the same time, Edison changed his rate structure to a time of use. And the little city of Vernon took on Edison an antitrust lawsuit and ended up not winning, but it was settled favorably for the city of Vernon. And the message was clear. The city is here to provide a competitive advantage to the business community. And when Edison said, here's the rate, Edison said, we're using anti-competitive practices, and we're going to do whatever it takes to make sure that our businesses have that competitive advantage. And at the time, it was about power rates. The power plant, the Vernon power plant, had been mothballed for a couple of decades. And the city basically said, you're going to charge us for an on-peak rate? Well, we're going to put the power plant on. And that created a kind of like a movement towards the power independence aspect. 1997, you see that same theme with the Marlboro generating station coming online and just maintaining that competitive advantage. And now we get to today. We're in 2022, and now we hear things like Farmer John is no longer going to be in Vernon, operating in Vernon. So what is the constant? Change. What is also the constant is the adaptation and the boldness of the city of Vernon in creating that positive work business environment. And what is the next bold move? What is the future of Vernon? And that's what this presentation is going to cover. Now I'm going to turn it over to Phil Burns from the Arroyo Group.
Thank you so much, Manny. And Dan, if you'd like to say another couple of words before I begin, that'd be fine. So, okay, wonderful. So Mayor Lopez, guess can't see you there, but and council members, a great pleasure to be with you this morning as we present our work to date on the Westside specific plan and are extremely interested in receiving your feedback on the work to date, on the direction of the plan, as Public Works Director Wall expressed in the beginning here. As a reminder, you all set forth a vision. You all set forth a direction when you decided to pursue a Westside specific plan, to hire a consultant, to hire us, to prepare this Westside specific plan on behalf of the city, to prepare a long-term plan, as Manny said, looking at what is the future of Vernon? What will it be in the next 30 years? And particularly within the Westside area, which is the portion of our community that needs the most help and which also has a great deal of opportunity. How to maintain the city's competitive advantage, how to create a more prosperous, diversified, resilient economy, and how to respond to long-term economic and governance threats that the city has confronted in the past. And so, today I would like to basically give you this report on where we are, receive your feedback. I'd like to kind of contextualize where we are by looking at the different components of a specific plan, tell you what we have prepared at this point, which is for your review, and what is yet to come. So we talk about three different aspects of a specific plan, the first being a vision. And the vision is the most important portion of the specific plan because that is what drives the other portions of the plan. However, the vision itself is not regulatory. So today we're going to be presenting the vision that we have kind of fleshed out based on that initial direction and push that you all gave us at the beginning of the project for your review. And after we conduct this study session, we will be moving on to preparing the second and third portions of the specific plan, which are the regulation, the zoning regulations, which will come into effect the day that the specific plan is adopted. Again, that's not today, right? But in the future, when the plan is actually adopted with the environmental impact report. And then those zoning regulations will go into effect, governing private development from that point on forward. And then also the implementation strategy, which we've had a good deal of conversation about with the stakeholders committee, and which consists of actions that are recommended for the city to undertake. So at the point that the specific plan is adopted, these implementation actions such as public works projects, development of public land, et cetera, those things will be placed on the staff's work program and will, staff will begin to work on those things to refine them. However, it's very important to note that in adopting the specific plan, the actual implementation actions themselves are not receiving their final approval, right? Staff will work on them, they will refine them, they will consider them in the context of, continuing change that goes on. And at some point in the future, the council will have the opportunity to make a final decision about whether to move ahead on the various implementation items that are recommended. So we worked very closely with the Stakeholders Advisory Committee and will continue to work with them through the remainder of the process. We shared and came up with together a list of 6 goals for the specific plan, which kind of drive the direction. And they are to reinvigorate the city's competitive advantage as a center of production. Secondly, to strengthen and provide long-term stability to the city's fiscal position. Third, to increase the residential population. Fourth, to diversify the West Side's land uses to take advantage of the economic landscape and economic opportunities of today. Fifth, to increase amenities that are available to the local resident population and to the workers that are today in Vernon. And then sixth, to create a physical environment that is supportive of all of these changes and actually gives a more positive identity to Vernon for the region. Now, of those 6 goals, one that has generated a lot of discussion is the goal to increase the residential population. And particularly, even though we have heard that there is broad agreement on the need to increase the residential population of the city, thinking about how to do that. So in the past, the city has zoned certain portions, certain parcels around the edge of the city for development and pursued affordable housing development. That's what we saw in Vernon Village. But the West Side strategy is a little bit different, right? The West Side strategy of increasing the residential population through mixed use, largely market rate housing, mixed use housing that's integrated with light industry, that's integrated with retail, that's integrated with office and other uses in specific clusters in the West Side area. And so we think that this strategy has multiple benefits for the city. One is that the sort of targeted population consists of singles, childless couples, other non-family households that are seeking to live close to downtown, close to the arts district, and they're the ones that are kind of driving the residential market in areas that are close to here currently. And these types of folks are the ones that are more likely to actually start and be involved in small and medium scale businesses themselves, creative businesses, small scale production businesses, and those kinds of things. And they often seek an environment where they can live and work in the same place or in close proximity. This is also the population that would probably stimulate the greatest demand for new restaurants and local retail businesses that would serve, of course, not just them, but the broader Vernon community. In being largely market rate, could help these projects pencil out and be feasible. And then one final thing that kind of guided the strategy with this is to understand that in order to attract residents, because if it's not going to be a majority of affordable housing, in order to attract residents to live in this area, we also have to create the supportive environment for them to do that, right? So we have to have the retail, we have to have the urban open spaces, we have to have some of the things that make it a good place to live, where people voluntarily choose to live in Vernon. And so this kind of direction has guided the build out of we call the vision, which is looking at those goals and your direction and placing them on the map and saying, what is the physical strategy for the West Side? So the first element, and probably the most important in the vision, is that the vast majority of the West Side should be preserved for the current industrial uses. It is really within a couple of defined and focused clusters in the West Side, clusters that have buildings that are remnants of Vernon's historical past, buildings that may be beautiful, that may have great value as creative office locations, as live work spaces, but what they do not have is a lot of value for today's industrial economy that's highly dependent upon trucking. And so taking the areas that have those kinds of buildings and really targeting those areas for providing additional flexibility for property owners to diversify land uses, bring in different land uses into those areas. South Santa Fe cluster is one. And then the second one is kind of right around here in City Hall and extending up along Santa Fe on the north. So these two clusters are, of course, linked by Santa Fe Avenue itself. And one thing that, as we were speaking with the Stakeholders Advisory Committee about this idea, and though they agreed that these were the primary areas in which it would make sense to have a more diversified land use strategy, they also recognized that it was going to be very important to be able to improve the street environment for some of these uses to come in, and particularly to address the high volume of heavy truck traffic that today exists on Santa Fe Avenue. And so the third element of the vision is really to divert trucks, except for the ones that have essential need to use Santa Fe Avenue, from Santa Fe Avenue, and strengthen that street as a walkable main street that is suitable for all of these different uses to come into the street. As we do that, then we also have a responsibility to our business owners in the West Side that power the economy today to give them access that is comparable, if not better, than the access that they have today. And so the fourth element of the strategy is really to create a much more functional truck corridor, Vernon truck corridor along Alameda East, and also strengthen truck movement on other streets in the West Side and the city. So as we look at those, at that kind of direction, you can see we looked at several specific sites within the West Side that we think are good action opportunities. They're not the only opportunities for development there, but a wide mix of uses, including, again, retail-oriented uses, office-oriented uses, what we call production retail, which are businesses that involve manufacturing in the back and sales in the front, and then live, work, and residential, multifamily residential as well. New build and adaptive reuse opportunities. So what could this look like in the future for Vernon? Here we see the South Santa Fe cluster, Santa Fe at 52nd Street today, and here is what it could look like in the future with implementation of the plan. Imagine that building, that large 3-story building there on the right side. It doesn't show, okay. On the kind of in the rear on the right side there, that's a beautiful building with high ceilings, lots of natural light, views of downtown. Imagine the ground floor of that building being modified into production retail businesses. Perhaps you have a coffee roaster in the back and a coffee shop in the front, bringing people into this area. Upper floors of the building being adaptively reused into live work uses. The rooftop may be used as a restaurant, additional restaurants and outdoor dining, as you see over there on the right-hand side of the image. New construction development as well, new mixed use that can be a part of this environment as well. And then a street environment that is much calmer than what we have today, much more walkable, on-street parking to serve the businesses that are right along Santa Fe, additional shade and a much more hospitable environment for these uses to exist and for the community in general to be. Secondly, let's look at what this area could be, the Civic Center in the future. Again, this is a long-range plan, but let's envision what that could feel like, really being the core or the center of Vernon, having an authentic city center and an authentic gathering place, a meeting place for folks in the city. Imagine that as residents, you have the opportunity to invite people to come visit you in Vernon, and you say, let's go meet right out here at the plaza. The plaza, as beautiful as it is right now, reimagined to be more of a place for people, a place where you can meet, ringed with again, the restaurants, the coffee shops, also some of the daily services that might be needed, the banks, the print shops for the City of Vernon business community could be served in this area. Connected back that way through an open passageway toward the toward this Petrelli site here, which could be redeveloped with a housing development that again brings in the people that are needed to power the retail demand that would be accommodated in this area. Connected with a nice streetscape along the front here in Santa Fe, and then catty corner over there on the southeast corner of Santa Fe and Pacific, that very large brick building you see here also envisioned as being changed into, perhaps it's a building that has a market inside, perhaps it also has restaurants or food, perhaps it has other kind of shops or evening time uses as well that make Vernon more of a destination in the evening, bring people into the city at a time when generally today it's very quiet. And so imagine that as the center of the city for the Civic Center area. So as we, I guess nice renderings and vision is all well and good, but the question is, can this actually work? Is there actually interest in having some of these projects done? So we have worked closely with property owners, the two properties in particular that I just showed to you in South Santa Fe and catty corner from this area. And the property owners there have expressed a significant amount of interest in pursuing redevelopment of this type. We've also undertaken feasibility analyses, physical feasibility, parking analysis, and financial feasibility to see whether these projects can work. And we feel confident that they can work in Vernon. And I think maybe one of the proof of the pudding of that is that recently the city received a kind of out of the blue proposal for a housing development on 28th Street in Santa Fe, a mixed use housing development to be constructed there. Now, while the Westside specific plan hasn't specifically contemplated this development and whether this location and design and all of that is actually something that we want to allow or encourage within the specific plan, I think that the broader point is made, right? There is development interest. There are people that are willing to make the investment, to risk the investment to bring in these types of uses into the city of Vernon. So as we look around these opportunity sites and districts nearby, and we plan for, again, this 30-year horizon for the specific plan area, we could see how residential units could be distributed across these clusters, again, all linked together through Santa Fe Avenue for a total of about 874 new residential units to come online. Okay, so that is the vision portion. That is the most important portion that we want to receive your feedback on today. I'm going to cover as well the regulation and the implementation portions briefly. The regulation, as I mentioned, we have not yet built out, and we will build it out based on direction from staff and your feedback today. The regulations will be zoning regulations. They're going to govern all private development, which happened after the adoption of the plan on forward. That'll include a zoning map. It'll say exactly which properties would have the additional land use flexibility or different land use standards. Issues such as, what kinds of mixes of uses would be required, what the maximum height of structures would be, what kind of incentives can be offered to developers to encourage them to retain historic or older structures, parking requirements, how to right size those parking requirements so that they don't remain the barrier to retail commercial use that they have been in the past in the city of Vernon, yet also provide sufficient supply to accommodate the uses and taking advantage of on-street parking, which we would propose to have along Santa Fe Avenue as part of that mix. Environmental standards as well to deal with, how if residential uses and industrial uses are moving into closer proximity, how do we ensure the continued viability and security of both of those uses and health of both of those uses vis-a-vis each other without harming the business community that's existing. And then third, I want to go over here the implementation strategies. So again, these are projects which would be affirmed in the strategy as part of the specific plan, but not your final approval. Plenty of work still ahead on all of these implementation items to refine them, to make sure that they can meet all of the needs of the community as well as any technical needs that come up in a further design process. So because I'm going to describe 3 implementation strategies today. The first is turning Alameda East into a Vernon truck corridor. The second is making Santa Fe more of a Main Street kind of environment. And then the third one is redevelopment of the Civic Center and Petrelli property. Number 1 and number 2 obviously have a lot to deal with transportation and traffic analysis. So here with us today, and we'll just briefly introduce my team as well. But here with us today is our traffic engineer, Deepak Kaushik from ITERIS, who's here to answer any questions, as well as Bob Paternoster and Lance Lowry from the Arroyo Group. And we have a couple other consultants who are on Zoom as well. So Deepak can speak more in depth about the traffic analysis that went into this, but I do want to point out that the traffic analysis that has been done has been a very robust analysis for a specific plan and has used kind of the most up-to-date data sources, including cell phone data, anonymized cell phone data, to understand traffic patterns in this area for cars, for trucks, and how we can really craft a strategy that can be effective at kind of fulfilling the vision that I mentioned before. The 3 steps of the strategy were first, understanding existing conditions, which I just mentioned. Secondly, taking a regional traffic model to model if we make all of these changes to the circulation system that I've discussed, then how would traffic flows change? And then third, to test the intersections. What would your experience at a driver be with those changed traffic flows? How much more delay would you encounter, right, at intersections, for example? So let's talk about the first project, which is the Vernon truck corridor. And again, the point of this is to be able to serve the Westside businesses here with an excellent truck access route along what today we refer to as Alameda East. Alameda East actually was established in the early 90s to be a priority access route for trucks entering the city. However, it's never fulfilled its promise. And I'm sure all of you understand the reason why it hasn't fulfilled that promise from driving on it. That is because there simply is not enough green light time. There's not enough green time along Alameda East for cars and trucks to get through the light, right? When cars and trucks are moving north and south along Alameda, you have a red light on Alameda East and vice versa. And so what is the solution to this? The solution to be able to have a lot more capacity along Alameda East is basically to allow those two movements to go together, those 2 parallel roadways to move at the same time, north and south. And that requires some signaling changes. That requires some modest intersection improvements and turning changes to make sure that cars would not hit each other going across the 2 roadways. Another thing that we learned from the traffic model was that if there is a diversion of many trucks from Santa Fe, this street, Alameda East, would need to carry quite a few more vehicles than it does today. We need to cover roughly double, from 4,500 vehicles a day up to about 8,500 vehicles a day. So, and here are some of the geometric changes that would be required. And certainly we can speak to this in a lot more detail if you have questions. But what's the kind of result of this analysis? Well, the result of the analysis is actually that because you have so much more time with a green light to move north and south on the Vernon truck corridor, even though you're doubling the amount of traffic that would need to use that street, delay will actually decrease and may actually decrease significantly, as you can see over here within the red box. So the the direction that we've received and the recommendation that we've received from the staff is to try to implement this project as soon as possible, be able to prove out that the truck corridor is indeed a viable means of access for the businesses today along the west side to be able to get in and out of where they need to go, and then move on to project number 2, which is to transform Santa Fe in a way that it becomes more like the main street that it was historically for the city, a more pedestrian-friendly environment that's more hospitable to retail, to restaurant, to live work, to residential, all of those kinds of uses. And so there's 2 different solutions along the southern portion of Santa Fe. Our traffic model showed that the southern portion of Santa Fe could be narrowed from 2 lanes in each direction with a center turn lane down to 1 lane in each direction with a center turn lane. This would cause a decrease in vehicular volume along the street by about 10,000 cars a day, but largely those cars would all move onto Pacific Boulevard. Why? Because we found out that the vast majority of cars that are traveling on Santa Fe today are actually not headed to Vernon, they're headed south of here. And so if they can use Santa Fe, well, many of them can also use Pacific as well. Trucks under the proposed changes would decrease by a great amount, almost 90% decrease of trucks along Santa Fe. And what you have instead of that, as we look at this again, is that you now have room for on-street parking along the street, for shortened pedestrian crossings. You have a quieter environment that allows for outdoor dining to happen. You can have bike access through bike lanes. You can have street trees that provide a lot of shade to the area. Looking at Santa Fe north of Vernon Avenue, Pacific, here, a little bit different traffic characteristics. So the traffic model showed that really vehicular traffic could not be diverted from this portion of the street, although truck volumes would decrease greatly, of course, with the diversion. And so what that means is that this portion of the street could also be modified to eliminate the central exchange lane and add on-street parking on both sides of the street, as well as tree wells to allow for the planting of large street trees, which would again, create a more comfortable environment along the street. What are the effects of making that change on traffic movement in the area? Well, we see that of course, there is a reduction in lanes on Santa Fe South, so you would anticipate that there would be an increase in traffic delay, and indeed there is, but we think that the magnitude of it is actually quite small. When you kind of trade off the added benefit of having so many services much closer here in the city of Vernon, the added 7 to 8 seconds in the morning and 19 seconds in the afternoon rush hour seem like they're a worthwhile trade-off. Finally, the third implementation project, which would be the redevelopment of Civic Center, including the adjacent Petrelli property. Here you saw this kind of, concept of what it could look like again here. And we know that, the level of development on the rear portion of the site is definitely an issue that warrants further study. It is not something that necessarily has to be settled at this point, at the time of the Westside specific plan and the adoption of the specific plan. However, our team did study multiple scenarios here in terms of how many units to bring into this area, but really the key determining factor is the Surplus Land Act, which was passed by the state in 2019, which requires that any site that is city-owned and is offered up for development must be offered first for 100% affordable housing, unless it is a site that accommodates over 300 units and is mixed use in nature. And therefore, the plan at this point has rendered a development of over 300 units here at this site. One thing I do want to mention about what that might mean in terms of traffic impact to the area. You see some of the traffic statistics there. And again, Deepak can answer more questions about all of this, but one real big advantage actually of redeveloping the Petrelli site is that the developer would probably be obligated, or could be certainly be obligated by the plan, to build a new signal light along Vernon Avenue, giving access into and out of the development. And as you do that, though, you can also make that signal accommodate the buildings that are on the south side of Vernon, the homes that are there. You can also make that signal into a pair, accommodate ins and outs of Furlong Place as well. So potentially the traffic kind of issue for residents and those who are right here in this area could actually be better than it is today with implementation of the project. So with that, I'll conclude my portion of the presentation, and I will hand it back to Dan to finish off.
So just like the power plant was critical in Vernon's evolution from being a city of farms to being a city of factories, the Westside specific plan will be critical in Vernon's next evolution to becoming a reinvigorated center of production with an increased residential population and diversified development. This concludes the presentation, and at this point in the workshop, we welcome any comments or discussion.
Mayor, we do have a speaker in someone in the audience who would like to address the council on this item.
Okay,
Steve Freed.
Good morning, Mayor Lopez and City Council members. Happy to be here today. This Westside project, I've been involved in many of the planning sessions. We appreciate that the city has allowed us to business owners and tenants and people doing business in the city to participate in this program. It's been very informative. I think it's something, a lot of what they're proposing would be a godsend for Vernon. But it doesn't, the time frame to do something like this project doesn't answer the immediate need the city has to increase voter rolls. It is a priority. We need more voters in this city. If somebody's willing to go to Santa Fe and 28th using their own money to build 150 units, and if it doesn't impact the business community negatively, then we should be rolling out the red carpet for them. It won't involve the city or the city expenses. It won't be a drain on our budget, and it's the fastest way to bring people in. Also, if that doesn't pan out, I think the development program for the City Hall area that they are proposing is excellent. But they need to get we can't wait another 4 or 5 years to break ground on something like this. We need to find a way to hurry this up and get it done. We need to increase our voter rolls. Thank you.
We have additional speakers. Marisa Ogin.
Hi, good morning, Mayor and Council. Good to see you finally. Yes, the Chamber has been involved on the stakeholder committee along with other residents here. And it's been a very substantive conversation and great to work with the Arroyo group. We agree that the first priority should be to streamline the Alameda East Street. I think that is an easy fix. It seems like there's a lot of consensus with the group to do that right away. In our opinion, we feel that that should be analyzed, the traffic patterns after for a length of time before any action on the Santa Fe change to a 1 lane. Right now, there's a lot of, the Chamber has some hesitancy over moving that to 1 lane right now, especially as what Steve said in talking about some of the priorities that we have. And obviously, we're going to talk about other priorities with the city. But in looking at the number 1 and number 2 of the goals is number 1 is to reinvigorate the city's competitive advantage as a center of production. That's what the stakeholder agreed is the number 1 priority. Number 2 is to ensure that Vernon is financially sustainable. And that includes making sure the city's customer base is strong. So those are our 2 guiding principles that are very important. So if we can ensure goods movement is strong and streamlined along Alameda, then we evaluate the patterns for Santa Fe, something like that. And of course, looking at the development and all the timing that's involved in all that, we need to be very thoughtful in this plan. So those are the Chamber's comments and kind of reiterating some of the stakeholder feedback on the committee, just for your reference. Thanks.
Eric Gustafson. Are there any attendees on Zoom with raised hands?
Yes, we have one, a Jack Klein. I'm going to go ahead and allow him to speak. Jack Klein, go ahead, unmute your mic.
Okay, thank you. This is Jack Klein, Mayor Lopez and City Council. Thank you for the opportunity. Reinforcing what Mariska and Steve Freed said, the balance of the plan where we're reducing vehicular traffic to an area that we want to, this is the discussion on Santa Fe, where we're reducing the car count by 10,000 under the plan of street side parking and narrowing the drive. Reducing the vehicular traffic when we're trying to establish an area for amenities for the folks within Vernon and the future residents, which the count's in the hundreds, not in the thousands, seems to be a stretch and counterintuitive, at least to me. I think the following the priorities of the group that the Arroyo group collected seems to be very consistent and actually fairly simple to do without potentially having a major impact. One other thing that I'd like to mention is, as the Arroyo speaker had mentioned, that the unfulfilled promises of the past, I think that it would be very important that the City Council take into consideration all of the specific plans that were mentioned earlier in the presentation and tour those plans and get a timeline from the time those plans have been adopted and what substantive improvements that were along the lines of the goals of those specific plans. We are seeing constantly unintended consequences of what are well-intended ideas and goals having significant negative impacts on the people that they're hoping to help. So I think that would be one, chase those low-hanging fruit that you have that would absolutely bring some of the priorities of both the community group and as stated earlier in the presentation, and two, before adopting a specific plan, really see what are the results of all these other specific plans around the city, and did they really provide for the goals that were targeted versus the impacts, the negative consequences of the community. Thank you very much.
And we have another raised hand from Juliet Goff.
Juliet Goff is on Zoom. Please go ahead.
Hi, good morning, Mayor Lopez, Council, everyone in the audience there. I'm happy to participate today. I was on the committee as well, and I want to compliment the Arroyo Group for being so inclusive and giving us chances to speak one-on-one with them with our thoughts. All I want to do is sort of piggyback on what others have just said, and to use Jack's term, the low-hanging fruit is definitely do Alameda, fix that, and let's see what that looks like. I think that'll go a long way on getting people to go along with more change if they can see that really works. And we do need to increase our voter pool, and we also need to increase the people that are eligible to be considered for council. Those are things that are very important. The thing I would like to know, and I haven't seen yet, is since it's very clearly stated what the goals are in terms of the reinvigorating our competitive advantage for center of production and strengthening the long-term fiscal stability of the city. Those are number one and number two. So I would like to see numbers, dollars, projections on how these changes are going to achieve those goals. Like if unfortunately, we've lost Farmer John, or we're losing Farmer John, we know what that parcel generates in terms of revenue to the city on a square foot basis. How are we going to replace that? So if we put in new uses, what kind of revenue is it going to generate to the city? What are we going to lose? When we increase our population, we all know that we are a donor city when it comes to the property tax revenue, how none of it really comes back to us. How much more are we going to get back at each increase in our population? Let's just understand the numbers before we make big decisions. But I highly recommend that we move forward on the traffic on Alameda, fix that. And if we can do some housing right away to increase our voter pool and people that are eligible to run for office, that would be ideal. Thank you very much.
And we have one last raised hand from Douglas William.
Douglas Williams, please go ahead.
Yes, good morning, City Council and everyone in the audience. My name is Douglas Williams, former chairman of the Vernon Chamber of Commerce and a member of the Business and Industry Council, and a family business in Vernon since 1971. Juliet Goff has mentioned, as did Steve Freed, the econometric analysis that has to be proven prior to the time that any of these investments go forth. And I think that should be a focus of the City Council. We all want to have residents move into Vernon, but they have to be into a facility that is economically advantageous to those developers who are doing so. Last I learned and last I saw, the numbers that the Arroyo Group were using were a little low, and I don't know that it's been revised to determine whether or not this is a viable proposition for the residential units to be constructed on a private basis. On a public basis, that's a different story. On a public basis, on a private basis, I think much more analysis needs to go in, and the city council should truly understand the specific costs and the ramifications of inviting in private investment into the city and how it is going to be profitable for them. Vernon is our home from an investment perspective. Most of us do not vote at the ballot box, but everybody that is in Vernon votes with their bank account. And I think we have to take a tremendous amount of pause and analysis to determine whether or not these are privately funded and whether they will work. I hope that they do. I want them to. I've been involved with this conversation for over 5 years, but I want to make sure that private investment is feasible with these projects. They're beautiful. The renderings are absolutely gorgeous. I think the Arroyo Group has fantastic artists, but at the end of the day, it has to be profitable and it has to be sustainable. And those are my comments, and I thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. I wish I was there, but I do not want to spew virus all over the city council chambers, so I'm home. Thank you very much.
And if there's anyone else who'd like to make a public comment, please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of the Zoom window. There are no more raised hands.
Do we have any more public comments there at City Council chambers?
Did Eric Gustafson want to address the council on this item? Mayor, that appears to be it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Is there any comments from council?
I'll go first. Thank you, everybody, for your comments, business as well. And this is a really good project for the city that we've been working with in Arroyo Group. But I know we've mentioned many times in these meetings, especially our one-on-ones, the traffic is the main issue that we need to deal with first. And if you can prove the traffic flow is going to improve, then we can talk about the next step of housing. But we also have to remember to keep it sustainable and competitive for Vernon. So whatever we build here, we have to keep that in mind. Our businesses need to still be competitive, and they still need to be the city itself needs to be sustainable going forward. You've heard us comment many times. You've sat with us, but my main concern is the traffic flow and how it's going to affect the businesses south of Vernon, as well as north of Vernon. You know, my comments already on that one-way Santa Fe. I don't like it. You know, growing up in Vernon, driving in the morning, taking my kids to school, coming into the city, coming out of the city, improve the flow of traffic, and then you can improve everything else. Thank you.
Do we have any further comments from council? I'll make a comment. As for myself, I too would like to see how Alameda is going to work first before we make any other steps in the direction that the Arroyo Group presented. I'm still skeptical about project number 3. As I had previously shared with the Arroyo Group, I feel that it's too many units in one place. And I think we should take a look at that and the impact that's going to make. But that's it for me. I don't know if anybody else has any other comments.
I do have a comment. I know one of the important things is a timeline. I know the end goal is 2050, but what does it look like in between from here to 2050? I'm curious. I know for me, a priority is housing as well. So how soon will housing be available? That's kind of more details that I like to see.
Yes, Councilmember Hilarios, just to answer that question specifically. So this is why the distinction between the regulation and the implementation strategies are important. The zoning regulations go into effect the day the plan is adopted. So if a private landowner wants to build housing on their property, they would be able to do that the date that the plan is adopted. If it is up to the city to develop public land, then it becomes a question, right? It becomes a question of all of you, being able to, I guess, provide some just outline. I think we've heard from the business community that there's a desire to bring in units as soon as possible, but there may also be a desire to leave that off until later. So I think that's a question that is up for the council to make a determination on in terms of the phasing of project number 3, as well as has been mentioned, by Mayor Lopez as well, the density of the development for project number 3.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question. What is the motive behind just targeting childless couples? And I know it's for the business and stuff like that, but how involved, since we want to get voters and stuff and people in council, how involved are those people, let's say in the art district politically, and how would they be involved here? Because that's what we need, more active residents and that they want to participate in council.
Yeah, I think that it can, with any group of people, I guess, any group of residents, there's typically only a small proportion that are very involved, right, in local government, even if it is a single family, suburban, small community, that is the case. I think that the way that projects are developed and who kind of even within that parameter of maybe more non-family households. And by the way, it's not that we're against families, but the environment in Vernon is, it may not be the most attractive place for family households that are looking for, the yard and the place to raise young children as other portions of the metropolitan area. Now, obviously understanding that all of you have done that, and kudos to you for doing that. But looking market-wide, I think that's kind of, what we see. So even within the group of non-family households, I think there may be differences. So if a building is being built kind of, simply aimed at folks who have jobs in downtown and are singles or whatever, that may not, that may be a population that in which a smaller proportion is more likely to be long-term involved than, say, a live-work project, where you're kind of tending to attract people who like an industrial environment. They're not just looking for a place to live close to downtown. They like being in this kind of place. They want to set down roots. Obviously, to the extent that they can be condominiums instead of apartments is helpful, but that's not something the city can regulate. So I think some of those are considerations, I guess, in terms of having a population that is invested in the city.
How about, I have a follow-up question. The state mandated new development to include percentage of low-income housing when you develop. With Vernon being at HUD rate and below, how is that going to affect the new development here in Vernon? Would it be considered, okay, well, we could make some regular housing versus a low-income portion of it?
So there is no overall requirement to include affordable housing within new development. Cities can impose that requirement if they want to. The requirement that the state has put on is more narrowly focused, so that it is on properties that cities actually own, right? Properties that cities actually have to be offered up first for low-income housing first before they can go out to kind of the private market, unless they are over 300 units. So it's not a guarantee that, you know, they will be developed for low-income housing. You know, but it is a right of first refusal for low-income housing developers.
So private development can do market value.
They can
It doesn't
do-
have to be regulated that it's low income unless we council approve something that way.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Yeah, thank you for that. To answer some of the earlier, or to speak on some of the earlier points. So Alameda in particular, and you know, Deepak, if you want to say anything else on this, please feel free after I'm done here. But just in terms of the timeline for Alameda East Vernon Truck Corridor, we've already developed. So we've been developing at a greater level of detail the infrastructural changes that would be needed to implement the truck corridor. And we've reached out to the city of Los Angeles to have a meeting with them because obviously they have part of the corridor and they actually control the signals along Alameda East. So we reached out to them. We are looking forward to a meeting very shortly with them and, you know, hopefully can gain the buy-in of the city of Los Angeles to implement the project. Okay. We are also conducting a fiscal analysis of the project as well. So that is underway, and that will be shared, you know, as well on the project website. When that is completed, early returns are that, you know, the kind of development that we're looking at would be fiscally advantageous to the city based, you know, over current trends. And one thing I did want to mention as well on the issue of center of, you know, of reinvigorating Vernon's competitive advantage as a center of production, because that was a very good point by Marisa and didn't speak to that much in the presentation. But I think that the, you know, the way that we see industrial manufacturing uses in Southern California, you know, we've all become painfully aware, right, especially this week, of some of the challenges that large scale production encounters, right, in California because of the regulatory environment and the you know, high wage state and all of the rest. Where industrial areas within, you know, the LA urban area tend to be going is either they go entirely towards distribution and logistics, or they become more of a mixed use district like this, where they're still active from a manufacturing standpoint. They're actually more active, I think, than what we've seen in the last few decades. But what you have is smaller scale production of more unique, locally crafted goods, because there is a market for that here, and there are consumer preferences, right, that tilt towards the more unique, tilt towards that kind of thing that can be produced locally and then sold, you know, hopefully on site here in Vernon and certainly throughout the LA metropolitan area and other areas. I'm happy to answer any other questions.
I just have one last question. What are the next steps? So the presentation happens today. What happens after this?
Yeah, thank you, Councilmember. The next steps, you know, are that, you know, we'll take back your feedback. I know, you know, some of some of the things that we talked about, for example, the exact phasing of projects 1, 2, and 3, I think that is something important, that if there are additional thoughts from the council, we would love to hear them, either today or later. But we basically will begin now to prepare the actual draft specific plan document, which will include all of the zoning regulations that will, establish the new land use regulations for the properties within the specific clusters. So that is the next step. We, at the same time, are preparing the environmental impact report. And then both of those documents, when finalized, will go out to the public for review. I assume there'll be a robust, public review and comment, at which point we will try to address those concerns, and then it will come back to you for your, official action on the plan.
Thank you.
Oh, yes, and we'll also be meeting with the Stakeholders Advisory Committee 2 more times throughout the process. Once to discuss zoning regulations as they're in development, and then the second time to review the full draft specific plan and draft EIR.
Do we have any further questions? No?
No. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Council.